always thought my neighbor was just weird, then I found out the truth. I, 28F, was thrilled to move into my new house, a cozy little place on a quiet cul-de-sac. I'd been saving up for years to buy it, and it felt like a dream come true. The neighborhood seemed quaint, lined with manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, and friendly neighbors who waved as I moved my boxes in. But then there was my next-door neighbor, Mr. Carlson, a wiry man in his late 60s with scruffy hair and hollow eyes that lingered a bit too long. The first day, I brushed off his intense stare, thinking maybe he was just curious about the new person in the neighborhood. But every time I left the house or looked out the window, he seemed to be there, watching me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. But then I started noticing other strange things. One morning, a tiny bird figurine appeared on my front porch. It was old, chipped, and painted a pale blue. I figured it must have been left by mistake, maybe by one of the neighborhood kids. But the next day, another gift showed up, a rusted locket with a faded picture inside that was too worn to make out. By the third day, when I found a small, broken mirror resting on my doormat, I couldn't ignore the creepy pattern. I asked the neighbors about Mr. Carlson, hoping someone would have some insight. But no one had much to say, other than that he'd lived in the neighborhood for years and generally kept to himself. They laughed off my concern, saying he was probably just lonely. But it was hard to laugh when I saw him outside every day, staring at my house like he could see right through the walls. Then things escalated. One night, I heard strange noises coming from the backyard, a faint scratching sound, like something or someone was moving around. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked out, and there he was, Mr. Carlson, standing at the edge of my yard, staring at my house. I froze, ducking back behind the curtain. But when I peeked out again, he was gone. The next morning, I noticed something even more disturbing. My back door was slightly open. I knew I'd locked it before going to bed, and now I was sure Mr. Carlson was behind it. The worst part was, nothing was missing. There was no sign of forced entry, no scattered belongings, just the feeling that someone had been there, poking around, invading my space. As the days went on, the strange gifts continued. One morning, I found an old photograph of a family from decades ago, their faces blurred and distorted by age. Another time, I found a doll's head, its hollow eyes staring up at me from the doormat. I decided I needed evidence, so I set up a small security camera by the front door. I hoped it would give me peace of mind. That night, I stayed up late, reviewing the footage every so often, expecting nothing. But around 2 a.m., there he was. Mr. Carlson approached the porch, looked directly into the camera, and placed something carefully on the ground, a small, blood-stained handkerchief. The camera captured his face in chilling detail, eyes wide, an unsettling smirk that looked almost satisfied. I watched as he turned and walked away slowly, as if savoring the moment. I was beyond scared. The next morning, I went to the police, showing them the footage and explaining everything. They took down my statement, but they didn't seem to think there was much they could do. He hasn't committed any crime, technically, one of the officers said with a shrug. They suggested I install more cameras, maybe get an alarm system. Their indifference only made my fear grow. As I left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling of Mr. Carlson's eyes on me, even though he wasn't there. The gifts stopped for a while, and I thought maybe he'd gotten bored. But just as I was beginning to relax, I found something that shook me to the core. In the middle of the night, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of the cameras, motion detected. I opened the app, dreading what I might see, and there he was again, standing at my back door. But this time, he didn't leave anything. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the camera with an unnerving smile, his eyes hollow and unblinking. Then, slowly, he raised his hand, pointing directly into the camera, before slowly dragging his finger across his neck. My blood ran cold. The next day, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, but I still felt haunted. Even miles away, I kept checking my phone, half expecting another notification. But nothing happened for a few days. I tried to convince myself that maybe he'd finally lost interest. I returned home reluctantly, feeling like I was stepping back into a nightmare. That first night back, I didn't sleep, too on edge to even close my eyes. But everything was quiet, until around 3 a.m., when I heard a faint scratching at my bedroom window. My heart pounded as I pulled the covers up, barely daring to breathe. In the morning, I noticed muddy footprints outside my window, leading away from the house. He'd been watching me while I slept. I went back to the police, this time more insistent, but they still couldn't do much without proof of a direct threat. It felt like I was trapped in a horror story, with no way to get out. Then, one night, the notifications from my security camera started flooding in, one after the other. I opened the app, shaking, and saw Mr. Carlson's face on every camera, staring into each lens. He moved from one camera to the next, his face close, his eyes empty and lifeless. When he reached the camera by my front door, he took out a piece of paper and held it up, blocking the view. The paper had a single sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting, asterisk, "You can't hide from me." Asterisk. I didn't go home that night, or the next. A few days later, a police officer called me to say that Mr. Carlson's house had been found completely empty. No trace of him anywhere, like he'd vanished into thin air. But I knew he was still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. I never found out why he targeted me or what he truly wanted. Months later, I found one last gift in my mailbox, a faded photograph of myself, taken from just outside my window, staring off into the distance with a hollow, terrified look in my eyes. That was the day I sold the house and left, never to look back. But even now, I sometimes feel like someone's watching me, just beyond the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike.